each question. Welcome back, everyone. So for this section, we were thinking of having just a reporting of the results from each of the questions from each of the groups. So we should have a presenter from each group, and we'll be going one by one through the questions and having each presenter kind of present the results or the summary of the discussions that were taking place, and then any final comments on that question before moving on to the next. So to start, for question 1, should the board require reviews of a utility's cost of service to its customers at certain intervals, such as every 2 to 5 years? Why or why not? We will start with the group 1, and our presenter is Samantha.
So I mentioned that I was going to struggle with how to summarize ours because it actually went on for a long time. I said there was debate, and I think that's probably, and I think it was a healthy debate. We did talk about periodic review of cost allocations, cost of service, whether rate cases, should be on kind of a regular cadence. And really, I think we had a good discussion on what is needed to meet the objectives of the statute. I think there was the policy objectives and then obviously the objectives of the statute. There, as you might expect and probably happen in the other rooms too, I think some of the customer groups maybe do things differently than the utilities. And then there are, I think, even differences between the customer groups and in the environmental interveners as well. So yeah, I think there's maybe an agreement to disagree on what is required, but I think one of the things that we talked about too was if there is going to be a check-in or if there is going to be a periodic look, what does that mean? Does it mean authority to change? Does it mean it's just an FYI? Does it, what's it going to be and what's it going to do? Because that is somewhat unclear under the framework that we have now. So I don't know if anybody else from the group wants to offer anything, but it's hard to summarize that really good debate that we had down to, just a little bit. So was I fair?
Yeah, it's fair.
All right, and then for group 2, we had Carrie.
Yes, so similar, definitely we had back and forth about a disagreement about this issue. Folks talked about obviously the reality that cost allocation will change over time based on other factors and the misalignment that can occur when you stay out too long. The concern about commercial and industrial customers potentially subsidizing residential customers, or vice versa, could occur in other circumstances. And then some folks were open to the idea that there should be a limit on the number of years that utilities can stay out. There was no real support expressed for the idea of requiring a regular rate cases to be required on a regular basis. And then on sort of the downside of that, of putting that kind of limitation in, there was concern that could cause an increase in rates for some of our utilities if they were to come into for a rate case more frequently, just due to revenue sharing mechanisms that are in place that are buying down depreciation. And the idea that Iowa already has low rates, so what are we accomplishing by coming in for rate cases, at least on the electric side, for one of our utilities in particular, but just concerns that, would we just end up with higher rates overall if there were more frequent rate cases?
Great. And then for the virtual breakout group, we have Max.
I'll be summarizing the conversation that took place among participants of the virtual breakout discussion. Please note that each of you do not mean there has been consensus on any of the topics discussed, and none of the takeaways are meant to serve as recommendation or proposal at this stage. In terms of the first question, we heard from participants that they felt that the utility cost of service to customers should be reviewed at regular intervals. These reviews will be distinct from rate cases and as such, they do not necessarily have to result in rate of return increases for the utility. I could instead focus on changes to costs, loads, and revenue to get a sense of what these changes have been since the utility last rate case was filed. Stakeholder commented that it would be helpful to have a docket or a process separate from the rate case process to make this type of assessment. It was noted that currently Mid-American provides cost of service data every 3 years since its last rate case filing. Overall, multiple stakeholders discussed that it seems like a time period of 3, 4, or 5 years for electric utility may be appropriate, benefiting both customer and the utility. According to the discussion, the utility needs to be able to recover prudently incurred costs and avoid expensive rate cases, while customers don't want to experience rate shocks. In terms of gas and water utility, it was suggested by some stakeholders that reviews should be more spread out, so occurring once every 5 or more years. Some stakeholders also brought up the question of when these reviews will occur, such as in the context of an IRP planning process in Iowa. In terms of the second question.
All right. Thank you, Max. Any final comments on question 1 from anyone before we move on? All right. So for question 2, multiple comments from the Charette prompts proposed implementing the option for utilities to file for multi-year rate plans. And we will start with what are the advantages and disadvantages of using multi-year rate plans, and proposed MYRPs for stakeholders follow a certain model. For group 1, we will start with Samantha.
I think that most of us in our group haven't lived with a multi-year rate plan, other than I think Iowa American Water had some examples. So there was a bit more of a philosophical discussion about what some of the benefits and detriments as well, could be. Certainty in size of rate increase and how to run their business for the utility. Certainty for size of increase for customers, they could kind of budget more. That also some efficiencies with not having routine rate cases or coming in for changing costs or things like that. I think the emphasis of our group was open to consideration, but it needs to be implemented correctly and have very clear guidelines, rules, boundaries, et cetera, for how it would actually work. I think there was a question on whether it was needed or whether it would supplant future test year and riders as we have now, because if you're building in a multi-year, you're kind of working on that. But I think there was an openness to at least learn more and discuss more and see how that would actually work, if that is something that was considered or proposed as a recommendation by the group. So, yeah, if anybody else from the group wants to chime in and add something.
You did great.
Sure, Paul, I'm doing this.
I know.
Carrie for group 2.
Yes, so we talked about some of the benefits being similar to what Samantha laid out with the rate predictability, revenue stability, reducing the regulatory burden, potentially of coming in for more rate cases. And then we talked about the benefit of timely cost recovery and reducing regulatory lag as a benefit for the utilities. There was a lot of discussion about how things are working with the current future test year process, concerns people have had with that process, and how that is currently pretty burdensome and very complex, and it's difficult for like folks who are not the utilities to have the same level of knowledge and engagement as the utilities have. So that's been an issue in terms of complexity and knowing what's in the forecast, et cetera. And then also there was, the conversation about having something like a future test year, and as well as all of the riders and things that are in place to mitigate utility risk. And then how do we make sure that we're also mitigating customer risk, and whether there's a way to put parameters in place that would balance those interests better.
Great, thank you. Max, for virtual.
In terms of the second question, stakeholders generally express that they don't know enough about the multi-year rate plan or the NYRPs to make an assessment at this point in time. Generally, the NYRP process seems extremely complex and expensive administratively. Stakeholders have the sense that the NYRP process may not necessarily yield favorable outcome for a ratepayer and does not necessarily allow for an overview of the prudence of costs incurred by the utility. Some noted that it would be important to get accurate forecasts on cost and revenue in order to get the NYRP right.
All right, thank you. Any other comments on multi-year rate plans before we move forward? All right, question 3, how has the introduction of a future test year approach to rate making benefited or negatively impacted ratepayers? In your opinion, what policy objective do the use of future test years address, and have there been any unintended consequences? For group 1, Samantha.
This was actually, I think, the shortest discussion that we had in our group, and I think the general consensus is that it's working as the statute intended. There were some growing pains, especially I think with the first future test year case and subsequent review proceeding. With the second one that that Iowa has seen, I think there was a general agreement that it went a little bit more smoothly once you get some experience on how to do that. But that's I think by and large there weren't a whole lot of concerns raised, and that everyone thought the statute is doing what it was intended to do.
All right, Carrie for group 2.
Was not the conversation that we had in our group. This was probably our longest conversation actually that we had, just about, yes, like there's definitely talk, folks mentioned that, as we go forward and there's more familiarity, this becomes something that is easier to do. But that there is still some concern that the information asymmetry, issues with forecasting, and then how exactly is the subsequent proceedings work, and that subsequent proceeding could use maybe more definition. It's necessary and important and could be better defined.
For the virtual group.
For third question, stakeholders noted that it is difficult to understand the credibility of cost and revenue forecasts under the future test year approach. Some describe this approach as double the effort, double the cost. As part of the discussion, some stakeholders brought up the idea that with rider in place, you don't necessarily need a future test year. Multiple stakeholders also discussed against the idea of the IRP and question how the IRP should be timed into this rate docket and whether the result of the IRP should be binding on utility. Another important question that came up in a conversation among stakeholders was how an IRP process could be developed that is flexible enough to account for changing circumstances, like the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act. In other words, there can be triggered to revise the IRP, and what would they look like? Stakeholders also discussed whether the IRP should be the foundation of the ARP, or if the ARP is necessary at all if Iowa adopts an IRP planning process.
Great, thank you. Any other comments on future test years before we move on? Carrie.
Just to circle back a little bit on that, reminds me of we talked about how a multi-year rate plan as well could be tied to an integrated resource plan, and how that could provide some of the structure around ensuring or having an idea of future capital outlays, and maybe mitigate the need for some riders. We also talked a little bit about distribution planning, since that is such a large capital expenditure as well. And isn't something that's been discussed a lot here yet, but planning for the distribution system would be another thing that goes into rate planning.
All right, we will move ahead to the second session. So for question one of the second breakout session, should the board's authority over rate cases and general rate making be expanded? If so, what additional authorities or responsibilities should the board be given and why? And if not, please explain why. For group one, Samantha.
I believe that we largely all believed that the board has the authority that it needs in the statute, but that at times that authority needs to be clarified. So that the legislative intent to defer to the board on decision making is more clear. And then I think, this is similar to some of the IRP, ARP comments we've heard, but some of the board's authority is siloed or is piecemeal. So the board has authority with respect to X and this piece and that piece, but not necessarily over the whole thing to take that holistic look at how a utility is operating outside of the rate case context. And then the other comment was, okay, that's fine if you're going to clarify and make sure they have the authority, always keep in mind of what we're trying to achieve with that grant of authority and what the board should be trying to achieve, which I think makes sense and connects back to the policy objectives that we're talking about.
Great, thank you. Carrie for group two.
Yes, there was, people do think the board has pretty broad authority to do what it needs to do under the current statute. There were a few specific things that were mentioned, including current statutory limitations on energy efficiency and demand response that aren't really allowing those resources to be fully utilized. Securitization, statutory authority that would be needed to allow for securitization. Whether the board has the authority to do its own DRs and publish those in the docket, which is something that happens in other states. And then a couple of other things, clarification on the acquisition, the net book value in water cases. And then just making sure that the board has broad enough authority in a regular rate case to look at innovative approaches to rate making. And then also there was the comments, just like Sam mentioned, where there are these scattered authorities that the board has, but there needs to be clarification about pulling those into one, or that the board does have authority to do the resource planning piece.
Max for the virtual group.
In terms of the first question, stakeholder brought up concern regarding transmission costs. Stakeholder discussed who has great authority, FERC or IOB, and the differences in transmission costs among utilities. Stakeholder brought up point made during yesterday's conversation, namely that service territory characteristics impact transmission costs. Stakeholder also noted differences in capital structure among utilities.
All right, thank you. Any other comments on this question before we move forward? All right, question two, to what extent should state regulation be harmonized with RTO operations and why?